Okay, fine. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society virtual lecture. I'm David Jacobson, former editor-in-chief of the Society's journal Strata. Today we are privileged to welcome Professor Ken Dark, who's my successor as editor-in-chief of Strata, who's going to talk to us on the archaeology of Jesus of Nazareth. One further matter, we are a charity, a registered charity, and rely on membership fees and generous donations to continue our activities of lectures, grants to students in normal times, to go on digs in Israel and to publish in our peer-reviewed journal Strata, and to publish our journal. As a member, not only do you help fund our activities, but you also get a complimentary copy of Strata. I do urge you to join by getting in contact with our administrator, Sheila Ford, who's on your screen. The cost of membership is very good value and very reasonable. Now, I just want to end, before we go to our lecture, with the following words. On behalf of the AIAS, I wish to express our deep sorrow and anxiety about the current hostilities that have engulfed Israel. Our thoughts are especially with all those who are suffering in consequence. AIAS stands in solidarity with all the people of Israel. We offer our steadfast support to all our members and many friends in the archaeological community in Israel. We look forward to a swift resolution of the present conflict and the safe return of the hostages to their countries. Now, returning to our lecturer, Ken Dark, who, as I've already mentioned, is currently the editor-in-chief of Strata. He has a very distinguished track record. After obtaining a PhD in archaeology and history from the University of Cambridge, Ken taught at the Universities of Oxford and Cambridge before moving to Reading, where he became Professor of Archaeology and History. Leaving Reading in 2021, he was visiting professor at the University of Navarra before coming to King's College in 2022. Ken has been awarded honorary professorial titles from 4 overseas universities and written over 100 academic publications, including 14 books. In addition to works for the wider public, he has directed many archaeological excavations and surveys in Europe and the Middle East, including at Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, Nazareth, and on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, where he did a superb surface survey. Ken is fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London and has been elected fellow of several other esteemed learned societies. I will end by saying that his work at Nazareth it has been published by the PEF in 2 of its special monograph volumes. Anyway, I've said enough. Over to you, Ken, and we all look forward to hearing your lecture.
Yes, thank you very much. So tonight I'm going to talk about Nazareth, and I'm essentially going to talk about material that I've covered in a context for the wider public, not just specialist archaeologists. In my recent, in the terms of the publisher, popular archaeology book, Archaeology of Jesus Nazareth, and that tries to make apparent or understandable to the general public the material that I published and the interpretations I published in my 2 earlier books about the archaeology of Nazareth, the ones you referred to that have been published by the PEF, the Palestine Exploration Fund, and also some material that I gave in the Myers lecture, the biannual lecture of the Royal Anthropological Institute, about the origins of Christian pilgrimage and the earliest Christian sites in Israel. And that article, that paper, was published in Strata. So there's a link there through to Strata.
Yes.
And let's begin then. Archaeology of Jesus Nazareth. My email address is on that screen. I'm sure David and Sheila will happily give it to you after if you don't catch it. But if you want to email me any questions, and I suggest you email me anything very technically archaeological, so that I can answer you in full in an email. If you've got a very deep archaeological question for me, that's the address, and I will happily respond as best I can. Before just commencing with the lecture, I will say at the outset that my voice is a bit croaky today. I've had a really bad cold and cough for just under a week, and at some points in that week had actually totally lost my voice. So please bear with me. I don't normally sound like this, and if I lose my voice during the lecture, it's not that I've lost the plot. It's not that I'm making a dramatic silence. It's just that the cough has got to me. Anyway, with no further ado, next slide, please. Nazareth, as you almost certainly know, is in what's now the north of Israel. It's just south of the Roman town of Sepphoris, and not far from what in Britain we usually call the Sea of Galilee. And you can see these, see Nazareth in relation to the Sea of Galilee on that map on the left. And I've marked on that map some other places that are relevant to early Christian archaeology in Israel. On the right of the slide, you see a picture of modern Nazareth. It's a small city, largely inhabited by a Muslim and Christian population. There is a Jewish community there, of course, but the present population is majority Muslim with a very, very substantial and long-established Christian population, as one might, I suppose, expect in a place which is best known around the world as the hometown of Jesus of Nazareth. And in that capacity, Nazareth is a well-known place to people everywhere I travel anyway. And if you say that you've worked on Nazareth, people immediately know that that's a place in Israel associated to them with Jesus. So next slide, please. Understandably, Christian pilgrims often come to Nazareth, and many visitors in Nazareth seek out places associated with Jesus. They're shown the Church of the Annunciation, the large modern church, which you see on the left of this slide. It is a really impressive building. People always say it's the biggest church in the 21st century Middle East. I don't know whether that's really true, but it's very big. It's a cathedral-sized church, though I'm told, not actually, technically, a cathedral. On the right, you see Mary's Well, also sometimes known as St. Mary's Well, a modern reconstruction of a genuinely Ottoman period structure, which was associated with a water supply used in medieval and post-medieval Nazareth as the town's main water supply, city's main water supply. The structure which is shown to tourists today is some way from the actual historic Mary's Well, which lies behind the church at the bottom right, the Church of St. Gabriel, or the Orthodox Church of the Annunciation. To understand why there's two churches of the Annunciation in Nazareth is partly due to the religious politics of Catholicism and Orthodoxy, but also partly due to the fact that even within Orthodox Christianity, the Annunciation, the time when the angel told Mary, the Virgin Mary, that she was about to have Jesus, that event in Orthodox Christianity is really seen as a two-part event taking place at two separate places, two separate locations. One at the Orthodox Church of the Annunciation, and one at what is now the Catholic Church of the Annunciation, seen on the left. But the Catholic Church of the Annunciation, just to make things even more complicated, was before the Crusader period, the Orthodox Church of the Annunciation, not this very building, of course. This very building is late 20th century, but the church that stood on its side in that period goes back to the 4th century. It goes back to a much earlier church, and that church was commemorating the first Annunciation in Orthodox terms. So we have two churches of the Annunciation, one of which is currently termed the Church of the Annunciation, and one of which can be termed, and I should call it, the Church of St. Gabriel, for ease of identification. Next slide, please. Although today, of course, a famous place for hundreds of years in Europe and the Mediterranean, Nazareth did not attract much attention from written sources for the first 1,000 years of the Christian era, as it were, common era. The texts that refer to Nazareth in that period are extremely rare. It's not just that Nazareth wasn't documented outside the Christian Gospels in the period of Jesus in the early 1st century. It's that it's not documented much at all. And the reason why I've got a picture of Beth Chan, the magnificent Roman and Byzantine town just to the south of Nazareth, a bit further than Sepphoris is to the north, but to the south, on the screen, is that a brilliant illustration of the way that Nazareth escapes textual mention in this period, in the pre-Crusader period, really. The Crusaders arrived in Nazareth in 1099, is that we are told in the late 5th century, in one reference, that Nazareth was the seat of a Christian bishop under the metropolitan, the big bishop, at Bethshan. But that bishop, that episcopal see, if you like, is never again mentioned. Even in the really, really seriously institutionally Christian Byzantine Empire in the 5th, 6th, and early 7th centuries, in what's now Israel, nobody thought, it seems, of referring to the Bishop of Nazareth ever again. And so we see in the pilgrim accounts. There's a pilgrimage account of a woman called Egeria, very fascinating text from the 380s probably, which refers to Nazareth. Then we have to wait until the 6th century for another really detailed account. We then have to wait until the late 7th century for another description of a pilgrim coming to Nazareth. This strikes me, having read a lot of late antique pilgrimage accounts for a lot of different places. Some of them are seriously a lot more remote and inaccessible than Nazareth. This strikes me as just bizarre. People were not writing about Nazareth. It's not just when Jesus was there, they weren't writing about it. They weren't writing about it when it was a really important place in the late 5th century Byzantine Empire, when it was the site of 2 serious pilgrimage churches later on in the Byzantine period. And this textual silence is one of the most striking things about Nazareth in the period in which I'm most interested, in the pre-Crusader period. When Nazareth is a Crusader centre, we get a little bit more description, we get a little bit more information. But even then, actually, not a lot of people are referring to Nazareth. So we're not going to be able to reconstruct Nazareth at any period, at least up until the Crusaders, probably later, in any physical sense, before 1099, and probably not a long time afterwards. And that places archaeology in a very important position in relation to this very important place in the history of the Christian Church, in the history of the Byzantine Empire, in the history of the Crusades. Now, it's an intriguing fact that even in the Gospels, there's not a lot of description of Nazareth in the time of Jesus. Luke's Gospel gives the most information, and that doesn't really tell us much at all. It says that there was a synagogue, whatever that means in an early first century context. It says that Nazareth was built in some sense on a hill. Well, Galilean settlements of that period are characteristically built both on hills and on hill slopes, in which they're terraced. Such settlements have been excavated and surveyed at many sites. And Indeed, on the flat. It just doesn't really tell us anything, except it was somewhat hilly. And it arguably, Luke's Gospel arguably tells us of a slope high enough to propel somebody to their death over when the villagers turn against Jesus. But what does that mean? And that obviously there's a settlement implied in the Gospels, and a settlement in which, according to the Gospels, Jesus lived with his family and Joseph, who was a tekton in Greek, which could mean a carpenter, as it's often translated, or it could mean any craftsman involved in construction work. A stoneworker, for example. Somebody who was a builder. Anyone in that sort of respect could be called a tekton. So again, we're not going to build a picture of the character or the physical or social or economic structure of first century Nazareth, or for that matter, Nazareth at any period before 1099, from this or any other written source. And that, again, places significance on archaeology. Next slide. Unfortunately, archaeologists have tended to ignore Nazareth. Yes, there have been some chance discoveries. There have been some claimed discoveries. But until the middle or late 20th century, there wasn't much actual archaeological work, either excavation or survey, which made its way into the published literature. And I'll say a bit about that, because there was archaeological excavation going on, and there was archaeological work going on. But we'll talk about that later. Just to get rid of some misconceptions first. Until the 1960s, most of what was available, at least in the published archaeological literature for Nazareth, consisted of burials. There were rock-cut tombs, almost all of which had been found by chance and looted, or at least excavated in an unscientific manner and then hardly published at all, at most with essentially sketch plan. There were a couple of sarcophagi displayed in Nazareth, of which you see one on the right. But like that sarcophagus, these were brought from elsewhere. And there was, of course, the Nazareth inscription, seen on the left here. Recent scientific work has given even more reason than we had before to doubt that the Nazareth inscription, which was not found in an excavation, but comes from an antiquities trading context, was actually found in Nazareth actually relates to Nazareth at all. At best, it might relate to the cemeteries of nearby Severis, but there really is a very strong case to claim that it's been misattributed. It probably is a genuine first century thing, but it has been falsely or mistakenly attributed to Nazareth. And of course, there are many possible motivations why someone would misattribute something to Nazareth. Many of the people interested in the archaeology of Nazareth in the 20th century, probably in the 21st century, are motivated in that interest from a Christian religious perspective, and they are keen to find evidence of Christianity or the Bible in Nazareth. Excuse me, I just need to have a drink because my throat is getting very dry. This might be a good occasion to talk about my own background for work on Nazareth. I was not working in Nazareth, or I didn't want to work in Nazareth for religious motivation. My basis for working in Nazareth was to understand the emergence of a Christian pilgrimage center of the late Roman and Byzantine periods against a non-Christian, in this case predominantly or wholly Jewish background. I'd searched for a suitable place to understand this phenomenon across several provinces of the Eastern Roman Empire, as it was in the 4th century, and settled on Nazareth and its immediate environs as a perfect test case in which to investigate this question. I see a question popping up about what does the Nazareth inscription say? It's an injunction, allegedly, or actually, an imperial injunction against grave robbing. And it says that basically don't remove bodies from graves by order of the emperor. Of course, those wishing to attribute the Nazareth inscription to Nazareth and to the 1st century, it may very well be a 1st century inscription, jump on this to say it's related to the resurrection of Jesus. But it probably isn't related to the resurrection of Jesus. It probably isn't from Nazareth, and it is therefore irrelevant to that question. Now, next slide, please. The big turning point in the published Archaeology of Nazareth, as it was before I started work looking for the emergence of its pilgrimage center in 2004, was work by Franciscan archaeologists on their property at the on the Catholic Church's property at the Church of the Annunciation in the center of modern Nazareth, seen on the left. And that work is forever associated with the extremely eminent Franciscan archaeologist Bellarmino Bagatti, seen on the right. He excavated in a sort of rescue, or in American English, salvage context, the remains of previous churches when the Church of the Annunciation that you see today was being constructed in the late 20th century. He did so hoping to find under it remains of the early 1st century, and I shall argue in a moment that in fact, as he thought, he did. But what he also found was a series of Crusader, Byzantine, and late Roman churches, which are themselves very interesting indeed, and contribute greatly to the archaeology of Nazareth. So what Bagatti did was a very creditable piece of archaeology. Unfortunately, how he did it was using archaeological methods which were very long out of date compared to state-of-the-art global archaeological techniques when he was working, for example, in the 60s. If he had dug the Church of the Annunciation in even a Wheelerian way, even the way Sir Mortimer Wheeler advocated and Kathleen Kenyon used in Jerusalem, for example, we would know a lot more about the archaeology of the Church of the Annunciation, and that would be a very good thing. But if he'd have used state-of-the-art 1960s methods, the sort of methods that were, speaking from England, being used by people like Martin Biddle or Philip Barker or Philip Raaks in Northwest Europe in the 1960s, we would know a massive amount more. But he didn't, and a lot of information was lost, but he was there doing rescue archaeology when the church was built, and did preserve, by record, a large amount of information about the sequence of that piece of central Nazareth. Next slide, please. What he found beneath all these earlier churches was a series of rock-cut spaces, some of which are silos, basically storage pits, some of which are agricultural installations, some of which seem to be storage caves, artificial caves, as seen here, some of which may well have had structures above them, by analogy with other sites, and because on some of the pieces of rock cutting that are still visible and that are shown in his photographs and plans, we have what seem to be the remains of rock-cut walls, which would have stood above the ground surface in the time when these other rock-cut features were below ground surface. Bagatti believed these were early 1st century. In my reanalysis of his data, I could reconstruct from the intercutting of rock-cut features, a stratigraphic method now widely established as valid, pioneered in the Ethiopian rock-cut churches of Lalibela, etc. I could establish that there was a whole sequence of these rock cut features, including a very datable series of refuge tunnels and features directly analogous to well-dated sites from the First Revolt. And so this, in conjunction with published artifacts associated with this sequence, enables us to say that Bagatti really did find early first century features at the Church of the Annunciation site, and that's what he thought he found. But there was a lot more complexity to the sequence than he thought, and these features suggest an agricultural settlement with quite a lot of processing installations for agricultural goods, probably more than one would expect from an individual farm. So an agricultural processing area, perhaps suggestive of a larger settlement than just a farm or a small scatter of houses. Next slide, please. Thank you very much for that comment. The other thing people had not addressed was the topography of early Nazareth. But we have really a lot of evidence for this. We have physical evidence in terms of the geology. We have, funnily enough, written evidence for the local crops and agricultural practices from late antiquity onward, and we have graphic evidence such as this famous painting, I think largely accurate in details that we can check, by Roberts in the early 19th century, which records, in this case, a crucial but much overlooked feature of first century and indeed much later Nazareth, and that was the Vadi or Wadi, to use the English term, running through the centre of what is now the city of Nazareth. And so you see in this 1830s picture the Church of the Annunciation, the former Church of the Annunciation, not the one there now, on the top right, with the white mosque, the only really old post-medieval mosque up there with its minaret, and the Vadi, the Wadi, going through the centre. And that is the feature that was cut into by some of the most peripheral excavations of the Church of the Annunciation site, and was also found when the Franciscan hostel near it was built in the 19th century. And it was partly visible and partly obscured in the early 19th century, but was filled in, and strangely enough, it might seem, a road put, in fact, the road that now goes past the Church of the Annunciation, put on top of its backfilling. So as you walk along that road that runs past the Church of the Annunciation, out the front of it today, if you go to Nazareth, you are essentially following the line of the Vadi, of the Wadi. Next slide, please. as well as that geological feature, which was, of course, a seasonal river, there are really a lot of small springs in the Nazareth area. I know, I've seen them. People, even well-known biblical scholars, and sadly, well-known biblical archaeologists have published this, claim that there is only Mary's Well as a water source for Nazareth. There are at least 3 other springs in modern Nazareth, natural springs. None of them as productive as Mary's Well, but 2 of them in central Nazareth rather than what was in the Roman period in the periphery. So anyway, what did I do at Nazareth myself? I took these environmental considerations and reanalysis of preceding excavations and surveys, such as they were, and combined them with an archaeological survey of the valley between Nazareth and Sepphoris, which is seen here. Next slide, please. In the valley, we conducted systematic field walking in 5-meter strips across the whole valley, which fortunately was, at least when we investigated it in the early 2000s, largely ploughed, largely available for field walking. And we recorded a vast amount of evidence, mostly, though by no means all, ceramics. There's a typical group on the left here, but also evidence of quarrying, small-scale quarrying associated with only Roman period and Byzantine period ceramics. Nothing earlier, nothing later. Next slide, please. That's quarrying on the right. Next slide, please. This is an example of the quarrying. Ah, right. It's okay. We can go on to this. And that other previous slide was another example of quarrying. Quarrying to remove, yes, this slide. Quarrying to remove big blocks. You can see a block cut but not removed on the right of the slide, and others which have been removed. Next slide, please. This quarrying exists in 2 clusters. A cluster around Sepphoris, on the Sepphoris side of the valley, and a cluster around Nazareth on the Nazareth side of the valley. And that coincides with the evidence presented in these distribution maps, which I hope you can see, but are produced in my books, which shows a series of settlements revealed by field walking, not visible on the surface, just in terms of ceramic and other spreads and clusters, typical of evidence you find across the Roman provinces. And essentially, bear in mind, I'm a Roman provincial archaeologist. I'm not a biblical archaeologist. I'm not a prehistorian. But I do know about the evidence from the rest of the Roman Empire, not all of it, of course, in East and West. And this technique of field walking, though really quite patchily applied in Israel, is a really powerful tool, if you like, for revealing Roman period settlement patterns, and it was here. Large numbers of small settlements, probably individual farms, at most hamlets or small clusters of buildings, revealed by scatters, often of hundreds and hundreds of sherds of pottery in fields turned up by the plough. Haven't got the time to discuss those in detail today. They're discussed in great detail in my books on Nazareth, particularly the first book I wrote on Roman and Byzantine period Nazareth and its hinterland. What is fascinating about these field walking data is that they brilliantly divide in a way that I couldn't have anticipated into sites closer to Sepphoris and sites closer to Nazareth, roughly divided across the middle of the intervening valley. And you can see on the left of these slides, the left of these pictures, a modern road running through the middle of the valley. And the sites to the north, or broadly, the sites to the north of that are characterized by having a typical provincial Roman artifact composition, objects like those in Sepphoris, but very fragmentary, of course, as their field walking finds, and often penumbras of much more eroded, much thinner spreads of artifacts around them, called conventionally in field walking studies elsewhere, manuring spreads, typically spreads of material which have come from a domestic context and spread out across the fields, with domestic waste being used for manuring. Closer to Nazareth, none of those manuring spreads occur. Closer to Nazareth, the composition of these assemblages of ceramics and other objects is entirely different, in the sense there are none of the objects, none of the artifact types which are associated with non-Jewish producers in the early Roman period, or for that matter, the mid-Roman period. The artifacts are all things that we know from other contexts were produced in Jewish contexts and produced in Jewish settlements and distributed among Jewish communities. It's not to say that Sepphoris was not Jewish, of course not. There is much evidence, as Eric Myers described in his lecture on Galilee in this series just this year, for a thriving Jewish population at Sepphoris in this period. It was almost certainly predominantly Jewish, but these assemblages closer to Nazareth lack the, if you want to use a modern word, the multiculturalism of normal provincial Roman artifact assemblages. There has to be an explanation for this. And what is really interesting is that it changes in the Byzantine period, when other types of objects get used in the area around Nazareth and in the area around Sepphoris. Objects not produced in Jewish contexts at all. Now, this isn't just a matter of people being wealthier near Sepphoris and poorer near Nazareth, because some of the objects that are found nearer Nazareth, for example, glass vessels, are usually said to be indicators of moderate wealth. And there is really not a wealth gradation in these artifact assemblages. And my interpretation of it, explained in my books, is that the community closer to Sepphoris was fully integrated with Roman provincial culture, as one would expect in an urban context, and that nearer Nazareth was, and in Nazareth, was in the Roman period, including the early Roman period, actively resisting. I think there's no other explanation for why one would not have a single non-Jewish object if it was just simply market economics, actively resisting Roman provincial culture. And so for that reason, I've suggested that this is the place in the whole Roman Empire in which one can see most clearly the active resistance of a community based on faith and on cultural identity to the overwhelming market forces, if you like, the overwhelming political force of what we used to call Romanization, but we often don't these days. Next slide, please. So in way of conclusion, what is there in the centre of Nazareth? Well, having surveyed the hinterland of Nazareth and found this very interesting pattern, it was important to reconsider early Roman and, for that matter, later Roman, central Nazareth. And there were not many options to do this. The Church of the Annunciation site could be reanalyzed, but one site had never been published, but had been extensively excavated for a very long time, in fact, since it was found in the 1850s. And that's the Sisters of Nazareth site. And many in the audience will probably have heard me bang on about the Sisters of Nazareth site in other contexts. And here we see the Sisters of Nazareth convent in its modern form on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, the museum that the convent established as a result of their own excavations. Probably the first excavation directed and staffed entirely by women. Almost certainly the first rescue excavation in the world directed by a woman, and which took place under the direction first of a woman who really should be in every archaeology history, Marie Chiraud, Mère Marie Chiraud, because she was the superior, the mother superior, if you like, of the convent in the late 19th century. Marie Chiraud, in fact, died in 1900. So, next slide, please. What did she find? Well, she found a whole series of walls and archaeological features, which I don't have time tonight to explain or go into detail for, but stretching across and beyond the convent site, which she recorded as the convent was built, and she discovered initially beneath the existing buildings that the nuns originally occupied before they built their current convent. This is a plan compiled from her records and his own by one of Giraud's successors in investigating the Sisters of Nazareth site, a Jesuit called Henri Senez. Senez did a marvelous job in pulling together records and evidence from a site. He'd been an architect before he'd been a clergyman, and he used those skills and his limited amount of archaeological background to understand and collate the evidence that had, even in his time, he started in the late 30s and finished in 1963, just before he died. And he also conducted his own excavations and archaeological surveys at the Sisters' site and in central Nazareth more generally. This evidence was, however, unpublished, or at least almost entirely unpublished. Bits and pieces of it come to light in published works. Almost entirely unpublished before I began work at the site in 2006. And between 2006 and 2010, we resurveyed the entire site, reanalyzed all the existing records, of which there were a very large number, and catalogued and recorded and reanalyzed all the finds that still existed from the earlier excavations. Next slide, please. Those excavations had shown that there was a Crusader church preceded by a very large and impressive Byzantine church at the site, of which these are fragments. Someone at the time, who again is the sister from Marie Giraud, G-I-R-A-U-D. These are fragments. There are many, many of them. Even now, at the Sisters of Nazareth site, someone at the time I was working on the site said, "Oh, I don't believe this. There was a Byzantine church at the Sisters of Nazareth, because where are the columns?" I refer you to the column on the top left. That is a Byzantine column. There are many. There are not only columns, there are characteristically Byzantine column capitals, like the one on the right. They said there are no mosaics. Well, there are hundreds, or certainly were hundreds, of multicolored tesserae, typical Byzantine tesserae, from mosaics, and one fragment of a mosaic. They said there are no inscriptions. Well, the bottom left is a Byzantine Greek inscription, read and confirmed by my colleague at King's College, Fiona Hara, who is a well-known Byzantine Greek expert, and that reads Christo, or Christos, maybe. It could be the name Christ, or it could be the Greek word, a part of the Greek word for blessing. So, you know, a critique based on that there is not enough evidence for the Byzantine Church is just not tenable. Next slide, please. We're nearly at the end. Earlier than the Byzantine Church, there was a cave church from which the earliest material is 4th century. It's very well preserved. Again, I haven't got enough time to talk about it tonight, but this was not at all published, not known before my work, really. And I can remember I invited a very, very eminent, I won't embarrass him by saying, very, very eminent Israeli Byzantine archaeologist, a specialist on churches, to the site. And I can see him now standing in this church, in this cave, about from where you're viewing this, saying, "How did I not know about this?" I felt quite the same, actually. When I first saw it, I just couldn't believe it could be what it looks like, but it actually is a very well preserved church with earliest material, coins, in fact, dating from the 4th century. Earlier than that, next slide, please. There are Jewish tombs dating from the Roman period. Indeed, the finds associated with them, so far as we can judge, and the form suggest a 1st century, presumably late 1st century date. The late 1st century being the mid to late 1st century being the probable date of the inception of these rock-cut tombs in Lower Galilee, where the site is. Next slide, please. And all of this passed from view when the site was burnt down in the late 12th century, probably when Nazareth was captured and its churches, we are told, burnt in 1187, and marvelously, from a thick burning layer over the site in the cave, we have this Crusader lamp, which Edna Stern, world expert on Crusader lamps in the Holy Land, tells me dates from the late 11th century, or possibly as late as 1200. So it fits marvelously. It's getting dark. Okay. To wind up then, next slide, please. All of this was entered through a monumental entrance in the Byzantine period and later. But, next slide, please. Through that, we come to a series of cisterns, some of them created out of much earlier silos, one of which can certainly be dated to the early 1st century due to associated finds. And next slide, please. And towards the south of all this, there is another part of what was in the Byzantine Church and the Crusader Church, a crypt containing a series of complex features, including a Jewish rock-cut tomb of the early Roman period, turned into a Christian chapel in the Crusader period, as we see on the right. And next slide, please. And in many ways, the star of the show, a rock-cut structure, which we see here. This rock-cut structure, next slide, please, stands preserved so high that it includes a doorway, a rock-cut stair to its upper story or roof, and beneath the ranging rod here, a portion of its original floor has been preserved. This hole in the middle of it was Senna's excavation, not mine, I should add. I've never excavated at the Sisters of Nazareth. Our permit was not to do excavation, our license. Next slide, please. There's an ancillary room, quite well preserved, partly due to its Crusader vaulting roof, seen here. And next slide, please. And this rock-cut structure was associated with domestic Roman period, domestic pottery and other finds, and was cut through by quarrying, very similar quarrying to we find in the countryside outside Nazareth, which itself is cut through by the forecourt for this rather nice, very well preserved Jewish tomb, rock-cut tomb, which can be typologically dated to the late 1st century. Next slide, please. And so this structure with domestic material associated with it predates the tomb, which cuts through quarrying, which cuts through the structure, and usefully the structure with all the domestic material includes in its floor a sherd of pottery which could not have been constructed, could not have been made prior to the turn of the era. So if this sherd of pottery must be 1st century or later, and the tomb must be before about 100, then we have here a 1st century structure, very well preserved in the centre of Nazareth and associated with domestic material, which I interpret as a partly rock-cut structure.
Ken, could you kindly, yes. Sorry to interrupt, but
yeah, I'm going to.
Can you wrap it up now?
I'm going to wrap it up now.
Okay.
This is it. This is it. A domestic structure, which can itself be dated to the 1st century. So if you want to, and this is my last line, if you want to see evidence of Jesus' Nazareth in Nazareth today, you can do so at the Sisters of Nazareth site, where all of this is still on display. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, plenty of food for thought there. I think we have time for questions. Anyway, you can find a lot of this in his excellent PDF annuals, which I can strongly recommend. Now, turning to the to the questions. Let's have a look. Let's go to the chat. There are 12 here. I will start with real questions here. A lot of people thanked you. They've already had to, unfortunately, depart. Here comes the first question I can really find here. Is it possible for tourists to visit the features under the convent?
Yes. I have a light here that I might be able to switch on. Let's see. Yes. So you can see me a bit better. Right now, yes, by appointment, you can visit in an individual capacity or in a small group, like a family or a small group of friends. You can visit the Sisters of Nazareth Archaeological Site. You just ring or email the convent. They're very modern nuns, and they will say to you, you know, possibly in French, possibly in English, when do you want to visit? And you set up an appointment with them, and a nun will take you around site.
Wonderful. And is it well explained? I mean, are there captions and
Unfortunately not. I'd intended to write captions, but we didn't get around to that. But the nuns can point out the main features. But all of this, everything I've said tonight, is as David said, detailed in a technical archaeological way in my 2 PDF books, and explained in a much more sort of basic way, and in a way which tells the story of the excavations and tells the story of my involvement really in a more narrative sense, in my recent book, Archaeology of Jesus Nazareth, which, if you want a kind of 1-volume short account, either to read back here or to take to Israel with you to read before you go to the site, is that I think the best thing to read. It also includes more of my subsequent thoughts, which didn't go into the PDF volumes.
Oh, right. Okay. Here's a question which I'd overlooked. Martin Ben Nathan. What does that Nazareth inscription that on that large stone say?
Oh, well, I tried to answer that as I went along, because I saw that question. It's a ruling against tomb robbing.
Okay.
And it's an imperial decree saying, essentially, don't rob tombs. Now, when people have interpreted the Nazareth inscription as being from actually 1st century Nazareth, of course, if you had a 1st century Nazareth inscription saying, don't take bodies out of tombs, that would be tremendously interesting for the history of Christianity. Unfortunately, the recent scientific analysis referenced in Archaeology of Jesus Nazareth, it's actually subsequent to my PDF volumes, shows that the inscription probably comes from Kos in Greek islands, essentially, in the Aegean Islands, I think.
Right. Sorry, where did you say it comes from?
Well, not from Israel is the kind of the point, but the possibility exists that it was an imported piece of stone which was made into this imperial inscription. But in my PEF volumes, I argued that if it was genuine, it probably came from the cemeteries, the extensive cemeteries of Sepphoris, where there are known inscriptions, rather than from the cemeteries of Nazareth, where there are no early inscriptions at all. In fact, there is one other early Roman period inscription, slightly later, that probably comes from the cemetery of Sepphoris, but was misattributed to Nazareth. So, and also the Crusaders have tended to confuse matters because they brought in stones, including an inscription, to the Church of the Annunciation for their building of their massive cathedral there.
Right. I have one question.
Yes.
From with those extensive ruins, remains in the convent, can one assume then that Nazareth was a fairly extensive settlement in the first century? Because you have those fairly magnificent late first century tombs.
Yeah, we can. Well, there are a number of things we can say about the size of Nazareth, and the most interesting one is that when people have tried, I say people, scholars have tried to reconstruct the extent of Jesus's Nazareth, they've often, understandably, drawn attention to the ring of rock-cut tombs that surround central Nazareth and said, well, obviously, Nazareth in the first century couldn't have extended beyond the ring of tombs for obvious religious reasons. But in actual fact, all the evidence now is that the tombs are later than the early first century. Some of them are first century, it seems, but later than the early first century. So early first century Nazareth could be more extensive than later first century and subsequent Roman period Nazareth. So we just don't know what size early Roman period Nazareth was. We do know that on two occasions, at the Sisters of Nazareth and at the Church of the Annunciation, tombs, rock-cut tombs, were either very, very close to earlier first century settlement evidence, or actually cut through structures which, well, a structure, the house of the Sisters of Nazareth, which was used for domestic occupation in the early first century. But of course, at the Sisters of Nazareth, there's an intervening phase of quarrying. So when the tomb was cut, the site was a quarry, not a house. But in any case, and I've checked this out with experts on Second Temple law, that wouldn't have been a problem to construct a tomb on a disused domestic site would not have been a problem, whereas to construct a house on a tomb would, of course, be. And I discuss this in my book. And in fact, among the other people I spoke to about this was Tessa, Tessa Rajak. So if you're listening, Tessa, thank you for that.
Okay, does anyone else have any quick questions? I think we'll take one or two more and then bring this excellent evening to a close. Any further questions? I can't see. Let's see if any have appeared. No, I think everyone seems pretty satisfied that you've given a very thorough account. We've had lots of messages of appreciation, which is...
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I overrun it. As I say, we had a few technical problems at the start.
We did, and I went on a bit as well. Anyway, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you on behalf of our society, on behalf of our members and our audience, for a very stimulating and thought-provoking lecture. Thank you very much, Ken.
Thank you for joining me this evening.
Now, Sheila, have you any messages or issues you wish to raise?
Issues at all, other than I will be in touch with everybody about our next lecture on the 16th of November to be given by our very own Professor Jacobson, who is now speaking, and we're all very much looking forward to your amazing lecture, David. So I will be in touch shortly. People can register then. Other than that, no, I have no other comments. Thank you, Ken. You know, you've spoken magnificently for a long time. I know you have a bad throat and a cough, so thank you so much.
Yes, okay.
It's always a pleasure to speak to the society.
Thank you. Till we meet again, everybody, I'm going to end the meeting and the recording now. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining. All the best. Bye-bye.